he had been relieved to discover that he did in fact have a dining room. Well, more like a great hall that wasn't quite all the way great. A long table, at least. It could have held 10, maybe 12 people. Not exactly a full court. The banners hanging from the rafters looked less like trophies captured from his enemies than not particularly well-made banners of suspiciously similar ages. It all held a rather dusty... Nope, let's try that again. It had all been rather dusty, until he summoned a goblin to clean. She had done a surprisingly good job in a short amount of time, at least. He drummed his fingers and then made himself stop. He glanced at Gerbeetle, who he had stationed near the sideboard in what he had to admit to himself was a pathetic grasp at familiarity. Dark wizards did not worry about... Dark wizards did not worry if they were about to be stood up. They were impatient. If anyone We're doing poorly. If they were impatient, everyone scrambled to appease them. No one was on fire, therefore he must not be impatient. Where was she? When she appeared at the doorway, he nearly knocked over his chair. Gerbeetle grabbed it before it could hit the floor, replacing it silently. He'd have said something, but his words deserted him. He feared Sirico's dress would be red and plunging. Instead, the princess floated in a blue cloud. The bottom could have been disintegrating, and he never would have noticed. Instead, his eyes were drawn to the graceful scoop of the neckline, hinting without revealing, and the gold belt that hugged the gentle flare of her hip. The gold collar went well, the ring slightly less so, almost as if it had been intended to match the belt. Sirico had surprisingly good taste, it seemed. Her hair hung in a simple braid over her shoulder, echoing the fall of the ends of the belt. The dress could hardly have been in style. Who knew how long it had lain in storage? But it suited her ethereal beauty perfectly. He forced himself to take a breath. She held her head up proudly, once again meeting his eyes. One of the goblin guards accompanying her gave her a little nudge in the small of her back, fortunately with the empty hand instead of the one holding the halberd. She took an unwilling step forward. He came back to his senses and forced himself to keep a measured pace as he walked the length of the not actually that long hall. Did he know any courtly graces at all? He didn't really think so. Should he offer his arm? He had enough time to imagine her looking at it with disdain before he reached her side. He opted to pull back her chair instead. "Do sit," he said, trying for a gently mocking tone. She would never accept sincerity, and he didn't want to order. She sat stiffly, her gaze roaming the room. He saw her lip curl slightly as she glanced at the banners and tried to hide his own wince. He tried not to take it personally. A keep of this size could hardly impress a princess. She'd probably had dancing lessons in a room larger than this. "Not a suitable setting," he said, trying to cover his wounded pride with snideness, "but we're not often graced with visitors of your loveliness." She was too ladylike to sniff, but he suspected she wanted to. Why had he said that? It was true, of course, but he said it in the nastiest way possible, reflexively. Was that how he always treated pretty girls? He wondered what had come first, the conviction that women would treat him with disdain, or his apparent determination to treat them like they would before they could get that far. He made his way to the head of the table opposite her, trying to feign nonchalance that he did not feel. A goblin poked its head in and gave it a wave. A goblin poked its head in, and he gave it a wave. The wave came out much better this time. He had practiced. More goblins trooped in, silver dishes clutched in claws that looked quite a bit cleaner than he had seen in the kitchens. Their sackcloth clothes looked several shades lighter in color, and appeared, at least at closer inspection, to be still damp. Several of them had added some kind of a decorative tartan sash, some of them matching, which started him down a mental trail about goblin clan lineages that he promptly abandoned. The stronger light did them no other favors, though. Nothing could disguise the enormous noses or the sickeningly green skin. One of the servers surreptitiously wiped his drippy nose on the back of his hand. Its partner kicked it. Gav pretended not to notice. But they kept their heads high, nearly tall enough to see over the table, and they deposited a little lidded dish in front of him. The goblin at his elbow whipped the lid off, staring anxiously at his face to catch his reaction. He had been unsure of what to expect from the state of the kitchen. Some kind of gruel, perhaps. A whole small animal that would need to be deboned. Instead, he merely found a rather excellent-looking steak, if a bit on the rare side. He gave the creature a tiny nod of approval, and he nearly collapsed with relief. Another goblin filled his goblet with a heavy red wine, before the lot of them scampered back the way they had come. His mouth filled with saliva, and he tried not to saw at the meat too eagerly. His stomach nearly cramped with hunger. It took effort not to allow his eyes to roll back with pleasure as the hot juices hit his tongue. He had eaten 2 or 3 bites with indecorous haste before he looked up to see how his guest fared. The princess sat with great dignity, her hands folded in her lap, her plate untouched. "Is your meal not to your liking, Highness?" Inwardly he cursed the goblins. Rare beef for a princess? Surely she was used to daintier fare. Pies of larks' tongues and rosewater ices, that sort of thing. They could have at least made her a salad. "I'm not entirely sure how you expect me to eat this," she said coldly. For a moment he teetered between scorning her for her daintiness and apologizing for providing such an unsuitable dish. And then he looked at the table in front of her and realized the actual problem. He sighed and gestured to Gurbeetle. "Please fetch the lady a knife." Gurbeetle, apparently a sensible sort, looked surprised, but headed for the door. "One that's sharp enough to actually cut things with," Gav added as the valet left. The last thing that he needed was to make her hack away at a steak with a butter knife. The goblin reappeared with a proper cutting knife. The princess raised her eyebrow. "You trust me with this?" He raised an eyebrow of his own. "You are at the other side of the table. I doubt that you'd get very far without me noticing. What are you planning to do? Throw it at me?" She blew a little breath out her nose, but opted to cut herself a bite of meat. As she ate, she eyed him speculatively. He took the opportunity to stuff another 2 bites of meat into his mouth, trying to chew suavely to make up for it. Not that he knew how one chewed in a suave manner, and he rather suspected his face had taken some odd contortions as a result. Suddenly her hand whipped back, and the knife was flying straight at his face. Time slowed down. His hand flipped of its own accord. A single, guttural syllable burned his throat, and the knife stuck in an invisible barrier mere inches from his face, ricocheting off in a flash of sparks. He tried not to flinch. To be truly dramatic, the knife should have lodged itself in the wall and quivered for a moment for them to stare at it. The knife, however, displayed a disappointing lack of drama. It skidded down the stone and landed with a thump. The scorched blade now ended in something of a hook instead of a proper point. Gav looked at it pointedly, trying to give his heart time to slow. Then he turned to look back at the princess when he thought he could speak without squeaking. She had folded her hands demurely back in her lap. He wanted to scream. "What the hell was that?" But he wasn't certain his voice would not shake. Instead, he made do with a raised eyebrow. She shrugged. father insisted I be able to defend myself. Assassins. You can't blame me for trying. Of the two of them, he felt pretty sure she was the more dangerous. But he certainly wouldn't let her know that. Nonchalance. People threw knives at him every day. He would not be intimidated by an unarmed girl now that she was unarmed again. Would you kindly fetch another knife, he said slowly to Gearbeetle, who was trembling by the sideboard, and cut her highness's steak for her? As the goblin hurried from the room, rather paler than before, he added to her, If he allows you to take this knife from him, I will punish him this time. Do you understand? He had been proud of coming up with that threat on the fly, but instead of flinching, she only looked briefly startled. Not horrified, just confused. He suddenly understood. What? He said, a flash of contempt charging through his veins, feeling justified for the first time.
Cut!
Let me finish this part.
Oh, boy.
Is the goblin not worth protecting? Too far beneath you? Let's see where the break is, because it does sound like it's time for me to stop.
What happened to the garbage?
Alright, we're going to stop there, even though it's a little random.